Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here for a second time with Dr. Joseph Henrich. He is professor and chair of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University, and today we're going to talk about a new book of his that is about to come out, The Weirdest People in the world. Oh, I missed the word here. The weirdest people in the world, how the West became psychologically peculiar and particularly prosperous. So, Dr. Henrich, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
It's great to be with you, Ricardo.
Okay, great. So, last time we spoke about weird psychology and what it stands for, what are the traits that characterize weird people. And today we're going to talk about how weird psychology evolved. But before we get into that and the program that was developed by the Catholic Church and that led to the development of certain institutions that are behind this psychology, let's follow the logic of the book and start with some basics. So there you talk about innate anchors, at least the ones that are important for us to understand the sort of kin-based institutions and also the ones that the Catholic Church influenced. So could you tell us about that first?
Yeah, well, let me start with some openers and some kind of background. So I think some of the key ideas are, one, that we need to think about human psychology as partially an adaptation to the products of cultural evolution. So that includes that it adapts ontogenetically to our technologies and our languages and our institutions. So in the book, I'm particularly interested in how our psychology adapts to institutions. As a cultural species who's heavily reliant on acquiring ideas, values, and beliefs from other members of our social group, one of the things that produces is social norms. So these are shared behavioral patterns of which when you deviate from them in some way, you're either incentivized to keep doing it or you're disincentivized to deviate. So that creates these social norms, and from those you can build institutions. So you might get an institution like marriage where there are social norms about how many spouses you can have, about what the roles are of each spouse, about which family children are more or less related to, or which ones they belong to in a cultural sense. So that gives rise to institutions. Now, in the case of humans, I make the case in the book that probably the most primordial and first of human institutions were probably those built around kinship and marriage. And so in laying those out and trying to explain why I think they're so important and so central as the first institutions is that they're built on features of our evolved psychology. So our tendency to be nice to close relatives, which we share with other species, our ability to pair bond, where males and females get together to kind of share the duties in child rearing, like we see in gorillas and some of the lesser apes, and our incest aversion, which we also see in other species, but in the case of humans, that can be extended into taboos and then used to shape and form the social structure. So those are three of the anchors that I think you build social norms on in order to get full institutions. And with that, you can build things like clans, you can build the kind of broad extended kin networks that we see in lots of mobile hunter-gatherers, kindreds, moieties, all kinds of things like that.
So until very recently in our evolutionary history and even in our written history, let's say, most of our institutions were kin-based, correct?
Yes. So you have things like age sets. So, for example, in Africa, there's lots of groups that have age set institutions. So these are situations where you get groups of young men who are about the same age, sometimes women, but mostly men, and you put them through some kind of bonding ritual. But what that's doing really is it's creating an institution that bonds many different clans together, for example. So each of these young men comes from a clan, and this gives them some cross-cutting ties and gives the overall society, the population, a little bit more coherence beyond just being a bunch of independent clans. But most of the time, the clans don't disappear. The age sets are just meant to connect the clans. So that's one of the kinds of institutions. Another kind is a segmentary lineage system, where you basically take the clans, but you recognize that the clans have different degrees of relatedness in some tree. Now, sometimes the tree's imagined, right? That if you actually had the genetics, for example, it wouldn't produce the same tree that people have in their heads. But what matters for people's social life and behavior in this case is what's in their heads, what they believe, and they see some clans as being more closely connected than others, and that means those clans can cooperate, engage in communal defense. The entire collection of clans can battle another tribal group or something like that. So human institutions, for a good portion of the scaling up of human societies, are built out of these building blocks that are rooted in kin-based institutions. So another thing that anthropologists have talked about is chiefdoms. So in a typical chiefdom, you'll have some number of clans. One of the clans will be the chiefly clan. But the clans still see themselves as related. And until you get to complex chiefdoms where you have stratification and some of the clans stop intermarrying with the other clans, there's still sets of relatedness, marriage ties and all that weave all these clans together, and political power is tied up in which clan you're from, how old you are, and where you are in the kinship diagram.
Mm-hmm. So in a chieftain we have a clan that rules all of the other clans, but how do we get there? Because if I'm not mistaken, in the book you talk a little bit about that, and as far as I remember, what happens is that there are different social institutions and different services that different clans provide to a particular society, and then from a certain point on, a clan starts gathering several different institutions and it becomes the ruling clan. Is that correct?
Well, so I bring in a case from New Guinea where an anthropologist seems to have caught that process in action. And the picture he sketches is that you have a bunch of clans, which can be found in lots of the societies in that region of New Guinea. And the clans have different ritual powers, kind of like jobs, rituals they're in charge of doing that might help with fishing or influence the weather or prevent floods. And in some sense, you can think of it as a long, ongoing bargaining thing, where certain clans, through some mechanisms in the society, were able to accumulate more ritualistic powers. And then eventually you can get a hold of the rituals that allow young men to become older men, marry, and whatnot. And so then you have a real strong lever. And so you can kind of see how a clan can become a chiefly clan by just accumulating power in an on-running bargaining process. And at some point, because of the size of a clan, you get this kind of autocatalytic effect where once one starts to get bigger, it has more power, it's even better at bargaining, and then you kind of push away. The other way is just conquest. So if you have one set of clans that conquer other clans or a set of clans that conquers another set of clans, then you can create stratification that way. So there's probably a different ways by which one clan can be put against another. I wanted to give one rich example, one of the best cases we have, I think, of how that process actually occurs on the ground. It's not a bunch of people sitting down, scratching their chins and hammering out the Constitution. So it's not a rational process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's usually not a rational process, and we will get to that later. So, and what are some of the changes that the emergence of agriculture brought about to human societies, and in terms of how they are organized?
Yeah, so one of the ideas I develop in the book is that with the emergence of agriculture, groups had to control territory. Because you put all these seeds in the ground, and depending on what kind of seeds you're using or what kind of cuttings you're using, in the case of something like cassava or yams, you need to control that territory at least long enough to harvest that. So for that, rather than having the extensive networks that mobile hunter-gatherer groups have, where you want to have lots of connections in different groups, lots of social ties. So you marry distant groups, or you build social relationships with different groups, so that if a drought hits in one place, you can go somewhere else. Now you've got to concentrate your ties so you can control territory. And one way that human groups seem to have done that is by building clans. So unilineal descent groups without very many cross-cutting or conflicting ties that come with the usual way that our genetics leads to conflicts between cousins, say, on one side of the family and cousins on the other side of the family because they're not related to each other. This unilineal descent system, whether it's through females, matrilineal kinship, or patrilineal kinship through males, reduces the number of conflicts of interest and lets groups through kinship form corporate groups. And those groups can then defend territory, protect crops, and then they can eventually prosper and move, because the thing about agriculture is you keep needing more and more land. So you keep kind of taking territory as you move out.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about how certain aspects of culture changed our psychology, particularly the weird one. In the book you mentioned that culture, we already done some studies that prove that culture can have a neurobiological effect on us. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I actually open the book with a case of reading, and it's because I think it's probably the single best documented example of how we have that a particular cultural value. So people decide that children should learn to read, so they start teaching children to read at a young age, and that actually changes your brain. But this turns out to be a general process because brains don't actually work the way our kind of intuitive models of the digital computer suggest they work. There's not some hardware that then you get software poured into it, the way culture might be poured into some kind of hardwired brain. Instead, through learning and interaction, learning from others as well as direct experience with things, we actually rewire parts of our brains to make us better at whatever we focus on. And what we focus on is often the culturally valued skills in our society. So if reading is one of the culturally valued skills, you get specialized circuitry in your left hemisphere. You get a thicker corpus callosum. This gives you a longer verbal memory. So these are all kind of byproducts of adapting your brain, or sometimes direct products of adapting your brain to being better at reading, being able to read well. But then that leads you to the question of, well, when did people start doing reading? When did reading become something that everybody does? So, writing goes well back into human evolutionary history, but it was only in the 16th century that people decided that, everyone should learn to read, and it's very important. And in the book, I make the case using lots of evidence from psychology, from economics and other places, that it was this notion of solo scriptura, that everybody should learn to read the Bible for themselves, that led people to first reading the Bible. It wasn't actually economic incentives. It was a religious belief that then made the population literate, and that then has downstream effects for later innovation, the Industrial Revolution, things like that.
Yeah. So last time we've already talked about weird psychology and what are the traits that characterize it, but what are the ones that you focus the most on in the book?
So a couple different categories. So one would be things related to individualism. So how people think about themselves, their relationships to others, also conformity, obedience, sort of compliance with authority, conformity to peers, and then a whole collection of things having to do with impersonal prosociality. So trust, cooperation, and fairness towards strangers. So a kind of default set of rules or norms that people apply when they're interacting with strangers. And then there's things related to like morality, which is close to the individualism, like how important relationships in particular contexts are versus the application of rules, how important the internal mental states or dispositions are of individuals, which relates to individualism, but then it crosses over with morality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is important to clarify. You talk about how our weird psychology evolved in the book, but it's not the case that you are trying to establish a sort of dichotomy between our weird psychology and all of the rest, like if there was a weird psychology and a non-weird one that encompassed all of the other psychologies that we might have in the world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the term weird was, when we originally coined it, and still my use in the book, is that it's a consciousness-raising device. That it's just meant to remind people that actually the most common participants in psychology experiments, economic experiments, neuroscience experiments, turn out to be a particularly psychologically unusual population when looked at in global perspective. And one of the things the book does is it kind of erases the need for any kind of dichotomous thinking because it provides a theory for what kind of variation we should see, why we expect it to vary continuously across societies, why it might vary along different dimensions in different places. And one of the things you get in the first chapter is a series of maps and other plots that show the world isn't weird versus non-weird, that show continuous variation, whether it's different shades of gray on a map or different bars in some of my bar charts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another thing that we've already mentioned in our last interview, but we could talk again a little bit about here, is the fact that there are some psychological phenomena that have been studied in weird societies that don't seem to exist or at least operate in the same way in non-weird societies, like, for example, cognitive dissonance and the fundamental attribution error, right?
Right. So those are two phenomena that if you take a course in psychology, you would encounter those, and they'd probably be presented to you as if they were features of human thinking. So it's called the fundamental attribution error. And it's the tendency for people to think dispositionally. So if you see someone slip on a floor, the inference is that they're clumsy. That's a dispositional attribution. Rather than saying, well, gosh, maybe there was a banana on the floor, or there was some kind of water on the floor, looking at the context. And what we find is that's quite variable, and the populations most commonly that commonly appear in psychology experiments, the weird population, tend to be at the extreme on that. But that, with like so many other traits, you can find continuous variation across that. Mm-hmm. It's that the populations that typically go into psychology experiments typically anchor the end of the distribution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what about emotions? I mean, how do you define emotions? Because it seems that they have a cultural component.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of debate in the field in terms of what the best way to define emotion. Some people want to have to tie it to some kind of facial expression. Other people think it's about how quick the reaction comes on. I don't really deal with that, and that's not a problem I want to take on in the book. I do think there's lots of variability in emotions, but I also think that there's good reason to think that there are evolved psychological roots to many emotions. So, for example, I've done some work on the emotion pride and linked it to the experience of different kinds of status, like prestige and dominance. And we share pride displays that look like the same kind of pride displays you would see in non-human primates. When you feel pride and you win the physical competition, you stand up, big broad chest, shoulders wide, that kind of pride expression. The same thing with the shame expression, where you become small and make yourself diminutive, you tend to back away. And that fits with the kind of experience of shame across societies. And the quality of research on that is increasing. So there's good reason to think there is some evolved psychological foundations to at least some collection of emotions. But culture can push that around, and I think it can create new emotions. So I focus on shame and guilt in the book. So this is something that anthropologists have been noticing for a long time, that some societies are much more oriented towards guilt. So this is individuals have their own standards. They might be influenced by society, but I might decide I'm going to focus on, really being in shape, and someone else might decide they want to be a really good drone flyer or something like that. So these are both things that are present in our society, but we decide we hold ourselves to different standards for those things. And I might feel guilty if I didn't go to the gym, or I ate I ate a big pizza or something like that. So those things would lead to guilt, but they're not really violations of the norms in our society. They're violations of personal standards that a person has acquired. Whereas shame, there's widely shared norms about how people should behave. You violate them and other people see that you violated them. You've got to kind of disappear. You're not inclined to go and repair. You're just inclined to disappear and kind of let it pass. The shame display, the demonstration of shame, is meant to tell others, hey, look, I know I goofed up. Don't worry, that won't happen again, kind of thing. Whereas with guilt, because it's like, say, suppose you told your friend you're going to pick them up at the airport. Well, people have different rules about whether you're supposed to pick friends up at the airport, but you might then go to try to repair the relationship because you've fallen below your own standard of what you should be doing as a friend. So it's that kind of difference. And we find that there's quite a bit of variation across societies in shame versus guilt. And one of the things I try to demonstrate is that with the theory, we can explain some of that variation.
But just to make this clear, it is not that in different societies people experience either guilt or shame. I mean, in all societies they experience at least a little bit of both.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good generalization. My only caution is I have tried in my own field work in the South Pacific to confirm for myself mostly that people are definitely experiencing guilt. They for sure have shame. They label it. They talk about it all the time. But trying to like carve out something specifically that people feel that can't be traced to some shame-related experience. So I've asked people, what if you're unfaithful to your spouse and nobody finds out about it and nobody can ever find out about it? They'll still say they feel kind of bad, but then if you probe a bit more, it sounds like they'll feel kind of bad because they will be afraid that somebody will find out. Like they don't really buy that the nobody will find out thing. So definitely lots of variation, certainly not two dichotomies. It could be that much of the guilt we see, however, is culturally constructed, that there could be human societies that are mostly shame. Maybe the building blocks of guilt can all be detected, but then you can make some societies like the Netherlands where guilt really dominates.
And what about impersonal prosociality? You've already mentioned this when I asked you about the traits that characterize weird people, but what is it about exactly?
So in the book, I make this distinction between interpersonal prosociality, where you're helping and cooperating and be fair with people you have some kind of relationship with. It doesn't have to be a direct personal relationship. They could be a friend of a friend, or they could be someone in your clan or a co-ethnic or something like that. But there's some set of links that is kind of telling you that it's the right thing to cooperate with this person. Impersonal sociality is, giving to charity when you don't know the person, you won't see them again. Being fair on an internet transaction because you think it's right not to steal the money when you have the chance, even though it's an impersonal organization that you'd be taking the money from. So where there's not any kind of personal relationship involved. So when you deal with a waitress, if you're driving on the road in the United States, you would typically give a tip at a restaurant. Of course, you don't do that everywhere, but in the U.S. you do. Now, there's always this question that economists ask. Why do you tip on the road? Because you're just going to get back in your car and keep driving down the highway. But most people seem to tip on the road because they've internalized this norm. It's not about the fact that I think I'm going to have some future interactions with this waiter, but I just think that tipping is the right thing to do because that's the norm of custom. So that's what I mean by impersonal process.
So at a certain point in the book, and I'm going to quote you now, you say that this is how cultural evolution often works, by tapping and repurposing our species' psychological idiosyncrasies in new ways. But can culture create aspects of psychology that fall completely outside of our evolved psychology or not?
Well, it's got to be able to build it out of some raw material. So it depends how much you want to stretch that. So it can't build something out of nothing. But I mean, something like reading. Reading is actually a good example if we go back to that, because there was clearly nobody did reading in the Paleolithic, and humans don't have any history of doing anything really like reading. Although we do have a history of recognizing objects, recognizing faces. We do have language. So you can think of our ability to read and write as a kind of recombination that cultural evolution figured out, putting together our linguistic system with our object recognition system. So if you look at the neurogeography of reading, it's, the sweet spots are right between language and object recognition. So it looks like, literally from a neurogeographic perspective, that it's trying to coordinate our understanding of words with our ability to recognize objects and put those together. And it actually impinges on our facial recognition, which is why weird people, populations that learn to read, so that's a much broader category than we would typically put there, are right hemisphere bias in the facial recognition.
Yeah. And because we're going to talk about the Catholic Church, and because nowadays people who are, let's say, more scientifically minded have certain ideas about the church and about religion. I mean, that they tend to associate negative traits to it and to church in particular. I would like to ask you if you think that harmful institutions or norms can last in human societies.
Well, for sure. I mean, it depends what you mean by harmful. But let's just take a purely Darwinian kind of fitness perspective. The demographic transition is where when people started having fewer and fewer kids. And what's interesting about modern industrialized societies is the richer you are, the fewer kids you have. The more time you spend in school, the fewer kids you have. And that starts spreading through the world in about 1870. So that's highly maladaptive from a Darwinian perspective. And it's persisted, and it's spreading. So that's a maladaptive behavior. That's an example of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we will get into the... Sorry?
Let me give you another example. So that's my demographic transition example. But another example would be there's good reason to believe that female circumcision, or what some people call FMG, female genital mutilation, is maladaptive because you're cutting off the clitoris of the young woman, and that can have you can get infections. There's no sexual pleasure. I mean, so there's all kinds of reasons why that could be bad for fitness, just from a public health, from a health perspective. And that has persisted for decades. International organizations have been trying to stamp it out. They're making some progress, but that's another example of a normative practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and we will talk a little bit more about this later, but as you said before, these institutions and norms are not developed consciously or rationally, at least most of the time. But could it be that at least some of them develop in particular ways because a majority of people in a given society, or at least the most influential ones, have a particular set of personality traits?
Yeah, well, so that's the one of the arguments in the book. So in the book, I point to a couple different cultural evolutionary forces that I think have a big effect on shaping things. And one of those is the idea that it has to fit with people's way of thinking. So one of the core arguments in the book is that when the Catholic Church reorganized people's kinship systems, it opened the door to some new kinds of psychology. But then the fact that those new kinds of ways of thinking, individualism, independence, nonconformity, that then led to new kinds of formal institutions. So how are we going to govern our charter town, our new town that we're forming? This is somewhere in medieval Germany, say. Well, we could build some kin-based institutions, or we could have a monarch, or we could have a representative assembly. And what you see spreading in places that have long exposure to the church, and I would infer weak families, weak kin-based institutions, are representative forms of government at the low, very much the grassroots level.
Mm-hmm. So let's get now into the church marriage and family program. So what are the things that changed people's psychology in the long run that came from this marriage and family program developed by the church?
Yeah, so I think let me provide a little bit of background. So there's lots of religions, of course, in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And what you can see if you look at what's happening, they're all experimenting with different ways of regulating families. So there's ideas that come out of Mosaic law about who's under the incest, counted as incest. So in other words, evoking maybe some of our incest aversion. But in other societies, those people are outside that circle. In Zoroastrianism over in Iran and Persia, people are marrying cousins and even marrying siblings becomes like a sacred and holy thing to do, a good thing to do. So there's a lot of close cousin marriage, and among royalty, there's even some brother-sister marriage. So they're doing one thing, a different thing. When Islam eventually comes along, this is a little bit later, but Mohammed says, you can only have 4 wives. Daughters have to inherit half of what the sons inherit. Both of those are not the practices that had been common before that, limitation on polygyny and inheritance for daughters. And so that then spreads and changes things in interesting ways. And then Christianity is also doing its own experiments. And so there's one branch of Christianity, so this isn't a Christian-wide thing, centered in Rome, that begins to have an accumulating number of rules and regulations about the family. Now, they have no polygyny, so that's going to be a big deal when you get out to the Germanic tribes, the Celtic tribes, groups like that, because they're all polygynous. They have concubinage, secondary wives, things like that. And then also increasing bans on cousin marriage, bans on marrying in-laws. So, for example, in the Bible, one biblically approved thing is something called levirate marriage. So when a man dies, his wife would marry his brother. And that preserves the bond between the clans. It's very functional. It's considered a wifely duty in some places. And then that also preserves the lineage, and everybody stays in the same clan. So that works nicely. One of the first things the Catholic Church does in like 4th century is ban that. And then later they ban first cousin marriage, eventually second cousin marriage. By year 1000, you're out to 6th cousin marriage that they're banning. They're also tying inheritance to individuals. And they're trying to get away all these cousins and uncles that normally take part of the land when someone dies. And they're doing that in part because they want individuals to be able to, on their deathbed, give the land to the church or give some portion of the land to the church. And then the church, this is part of the church's poverty program, but the church ends up becoming the largest landowner in Europe over many centuries because of these bequests. And they have a number of other schemes related to that.
Mm-hmm. And was there any particular reason why the church adopted these incest prohibitions?
Yeah, well, that's a question. So that's a deep, important question. And there's a number of different layers and kind of approaches to it. So at a superficial level, it certainly seems like people believe that God wanted them to do that. And they would interpret plagues and other disasters in light of people are having incest, right? And God's pissed off that people are marrying their cousins because that's what was defined as incest. And we've got to stamp out this incest if we want these plagues to stop hitting. So that's like a public health program almost. It just depends on, it's just a different theory of what causes the problem. Now, famously, Jack Goody has argued that the church was also getting wealthy. Now, I haven't seen any good evidence where people were making the explicit argument that if we do this, we can fill the coffers. But you can imagine that individual bishops and individual parishes might notice that when they do that, they seem to get a little bit richer, or maybe those parishes that are enforcing it are richer, so the other parishes or the other bishoprics go, yeah, maybe we should do what they do, and maybe one of the things they do is really crack down on this marriage and family program. No direct evidence of that, but that's the kind of process I see that could be going on in the background without anybody having a kind of deep strategy. It can all be very local, kind of maximizing decisions or just copying the more successful groups that are energetically implementing this.
Mm-hmm. So just to add some perspective to this from an historical perspective, let's say, so we are talking about the Roman Catholic Church and about Western Europe mostly, right?
Right. So this is the Western Church. Now, remember, it's expanding. So it's based in Rome. By late antiquity, Christianity is the religion of Rome. The church is still united at this point. So there's a powerful bishop in Constantinople and a powerful bishop in Rome. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome. But gradually they're diverging. So what's going on under the Pope and what's going on in Western, now it's not united, so it's kind of loosely interconnected, are different things, and they're getting further and further apart. You can see like they're having these council meetings, and you can look at who attends the council meetings. And sometimes they cross over and attend each other's meetings, but a lot of times it's just the Western bishops or just the Eastern bishops. And so this is causing different implementations of the marriage and family program in these different places. Of course, the Great Schism isn't until the 11th century. That's when the church officially partitions into the Orthodox and Roman Catholic lines. But there's effectively most are, growing split over that period of time. So that's why Eastern Europe gets a different treatment than Western Europe. Crucial to the story is what happened in the Carolingian Empire. So around 800, Charlemagne becomes emperor of the Romans, crowned by Pope Leo III, I believe. And he then begins implementing. So the church is kind of teamed up with secular powers then, and they're starting the parish system, and they're implementing this to root out incest. So some of the few writings we have from that period, from Charlemagne and from his father Pepin, are actually about enforcing these incest taboos. So the parts of Europe that are under the Carolingian Empire get a particularly high dosage of the marriage and family program, and so you can actually detect that. So this is interesting, and I use this later in the book because Southern Italy doesn't get this, right? Southern Italy is not in the Carolingian Empire, and you can detect interesting variation up and down the Italian peninsula, and we think it's because of this Carolingian effect.
Mhm. So with the written records that we have, you were able to control for this variation in terms of the implementation of the marriage and family program by the church in different areas of Western Europe.
Yeah, so what we have is not as fine-grained as you suggested, although we may yet get there. So the data that I present in the book, we know when the bishops were founded in different parts of Europe. So we have a date and a GPS location for every bishopric. And then we can draw a circle around that bishopric. We tried a lot of different circles, but just say 100 kilometers. And then we say, okay, we look at modern populations and their psychology in that perimeter, or we can look at some data from the 20th century on their cousin marriage practices. And we find that geographic blocks of Europe that were around a bishopric, the more centuries they were under the church, meaning that bishopric was present, the lower the rates of cousin marriage in the 20th century, and the weirder their psychology. So meaning greater individualism, less conformity, and more trust and fairness towards strangers. So we used the number of centuries that little block was under the church to predict things. We can do that for Italy as well, we have more detailed data from different provinces in Italy.
Mm-hmm. And why was this so important? Why were these prohibitions against cousin marriage so important that led to the evolution of our weird psychology? I mean, immediately after that, what are some of the aspects of people's behavior, sociality that changed significantly?
Yeah, so this brings us back to where we started, which is the idea that people's psychology adapts to the institutions they live in. So when you're in a world of intensive kinship, your social relations are largely determined by your birth. You're going to have all these relatives that you have obligations, privileges to. Your land is going to be accessed by your clan or your kinship. Your ancestors are going to be buried in there. You might have ancestral rites or other kinds of things that you'll do to those propitiate those ancestors. If you don't do those things, bad luck will happen. If you get injured, the network you're going to depend on to nurse you through the injury is this kinship of other people who have obligations to you if you get injured. When you get old, you're going to rely on those people to take care of you. So there's just this whole set of things which your whole social life is tied into. And this then fosters a psychology for conforming to that group, for obeying authority. So older members of that group, often males, but male-female differences, and this low individualism, reliance on shame, because that's the notion of social control in this group. And when the church breaks all that down, now it doesn't do it quickly, it does it over centuries by slowly undermining things. The individuals are more free to set off to the local charter town, to move to a different manor, because manorialism is common now. There's lords and people have small farm plots, but they can go set up a new farm plot. Some people, not everyone's a free person. And so this individualism then then you need social security nets, people to take care of you when you're old. So people begin forming voluntary associations. You don't see these in lots of other histories of other societies to the degree that Europeans invested in them, because people would rely on their clans or their kindreds or their caste members. But Europeans had to build these, and they were often built around religion, so it's some religious group. They eventually became occupational guilds in many cases. People started joining monasteries, because you can become a brother or a member of a monastery and you get the same kind of care. Churches, people became more invested in the churches. So universities appeared. You get this proliferation of voluntary associations. So some of the historical data in the book is just showing that coincident with this period when you're getting this breaking down of the kinship, you're also getting a rise in the proliferation of these various kinds of historically known voluntary societies.
Mm-hmm. And there was also an urbanization of society, right? People started moving more and more to living in cities and working there and basically doing their life there.
Yeah. So occupation became less determined by the occupation of your family or your clan or where you're from. People moved to the towns. The towns were often organizations in themselves. So you'd essentially join a town, there's charter towns and charter cities. And you could move there and live there for a year or two. Sometimes it would take longer, but you could then become a citizen, and that would give you rights and privileges within that city, as long as you followed certain rules. And you could get kicked out if you started doing bad stuff. And those towns wanted to recruit the best people, so they were, they could be selective. They might want richer merchants. They might want people with particular skills, and so they're recruiting them. So people would go and they'd want to work on their skills, and they'd move to the best towns. So if your town was particularly prosperous and well governed, you'd attract lots of migrants, lots of skilled ones. You could be selective, and then you would prosper even more. So there's this competition among towns, and this can occur because people can freely move. They're not tied to their land anymore, and they're more individualistic. What they have to sell is not their social relationship and their kinfolk, but they have to sell what they can do. So they begin to emphasize their own attributes, aspirations. So this is the world of individualism.
Mm-hmm. So before we continue analyzing the changes that were brought up by this marriage and family program by the church, let me just ask you, because you've done a little bit of research on this, let's talk a little bit about kinship in China. That is a collectivistic society, and it has something to do with rice cultivation and irrigation, right?
Yeah, so in the book I pick up on the research of Thomas Talhelm and lots of others, lots of historians before Thomas. Thomas has done the most recent stuff using psychology experiments, just linking the intensity of rice agriculture in whether it's prefecture, so I have a graduate student now, Graham Noblin, who's working on that, or higher levels provinces, to various aspects of psychology. So Thomas took a lot of university students from different parts of China, and he was able to explain the variation in their kind of in-group parochialism and their analytic versus holistic thinking, using the importance of rice paddy agriculture in the place where they come from. Now, in the book, I make the claim that the best candidate for the thing, so how does rice get into our heads? I think it gets into our heads because it favors certain kinds of social institutions. So things like clans are very common in areas with lots of rice agriculture. There may be other kinds of social organizations which build these tight links that can be found in rice agriculture, and that then cashes out in the psychological differences. So I think China is a kind of independent test of the theory, because there's no church, but there can be things that affect the tightness, the kinship intensity, and then we can use those to see if the same theory pans out.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that church imposed on Western Europe, and that also happened in other societies that were not under the influence of the church, but anyway, it imposed monogamous marriage. Why is that important here?
Yeah, so monogamous marriage is one of the key elements in the marriage and family program. And I summarize research in the book showing that monogamous marriage probably does lots of things, but one thing it does is it reduces male-male competition. So, 85% of human societies in the anthropological record are polygynous. When the wealthy, higher status men, it's always wealthy and higher status men. It could be great hunters, great shamans, great warriors, just rich guys. They would get a disproportionate share of the wives, and sometimes this could get really extreme. But even if it's not very extreme, it means that there's a pool of poor, low-status males that have no prospects. They can't get into the marriage and mating market. They can't become a father. And one of the points I make is becoming a father, getting married and becoming a father actually has measurable hormonal effects on males. So the testosterone drops when you get married in Western males, and when you have children, especially if you handle the children. So the details of the norms about childcare actually matter. And this can be associated with less risk-taking, less attempts to climb the status hierarchy. Whereas you can look at the point of view, if you're one of the men in this low-status pool, in order to get into the marriage and mating market, which is really important to animals, you have to jump up the status hierarchy. So you have to take big risks. Because if you increase your status by 10%, you're still in the pool most of the time, unless you're right on the cusp. So that's going to lead to all kinds of things like crime. And then I review various lines of evidence in the book to show that that's the case. So just by imposing monogamous marriage, the church is going to have an effect of reducing male-male competition, lowering crime rates, and creating a world that's more conducive to exchange among strangers, contracting, commerce, all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, monogamous marriage domesticates men, right? Yeah. So I've already asked you about impersonal prosociality. What is the relationship between impersonal prosociality and market integration?
Yeah, so that's another one of the institutes. So again, the book is about the relationship between institutions and psychology. And in the book, I make the case that because of how the church affected the social arrangements, people were able to go into these urban areas, and you get a new kind of commerce. There's always been trade. Trade goes way back. Lots of societies have trade and commerce. But people began having to engage with strangers and much more. And they began to build long-distance relationships among strangers as trade flowed around. So in these markets, you get the development of market norms. And market norms get in your head, and they give you a set of rules about how to behave with strangers. And that's a lot of times what economists measure in these behavioral games. And so one of the ways we can measure this is by looking at the relationship between market integration across societies and how people play the behavioral games. And in the book, I review some studies showing that the more market integrated a community is, even comparing individuals or villages in the same ethnic group, you can show that the more market integrated folks are more willing to cooperate with strangers. And then that has downstream effects for your ability to build voluntary associations. They can do policing. So markets can kind of catalyze the process I've been describing. The effectiveness of voluntary associations is greater if we have this baseline set of rules for being fair to strangers. Things go from there.
Mm-hmm. And with these more individualistic societies, more people that are more independent and less skin-based, what are the sorts of changes that brought to systems of law?
Oh, systems of law, right. So one of the ideas that I deal with in the book is that as people began to think about the world differently, when they went to write down laws and create laws, they wrote the laws differently than you would find in other societies. So it's in the Western law tradition, beginning in the High Middle Ages, that you really see the individual move to the center of law. And lawyers get very concerned about the internal mental states of the actor. So suddenly to commit a murder, you have to have done something, you have to have wanted to kill the guy, you have to have been using a method you believed would do it. And so there's a kind of dissecting of the internal mental states of the actor, and then you get a gradation of punishment depending on how many of these mental states we can pile up. Other societies some societies don't care about intent, but many societies do have some interest in intent. In Roman law, there's some recognition of the importance of intent, but there wasn't a focus on the kind of details of the mental states. So it becomes tied to the individual. You can see that gradually in Western laws, like it's no longer the case that you can put the father in jail for the crimes of the son, which is something you find common in other places, such as China. And then you get very concerned about the individual mental states. And the other thing that's interesting about how lawyers were looking at the law is they wanted to derive the legal system from some set of underlying principles. So they get the Roman law, the Code of Justinian, and it's just a compilation. It's like a mosaic of different situations and what kind of laws apply. But they want it to be unified, and I think of this as relating to analytic thinking. So you want to generate a few principles from which all the specific cases can be explained. And this one famous lawyer historian, Harold Berman, makes the case that the early canonists, the early lawyers, were looking at the old Justinian Code, and they thought they saw principles in there that probably weren't actually there, because they thought that this must be based on some primitives. But he makes the case that there actually weren't any primitives.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because it seems to me that many of the things that we are talking about here or at least some of them are values that we tend to associate with the Enlightenment. So was it the case that this marriage and family program developed by the church over time created a basis or a sociological basis, let's say, for the development of the Enlightenment?
Yeah, so that's one of the arguments I make at the end of the book, is that a lot of the ideas we see in the Enlightenment that we sometimes credit Enlightenment thinkers with had been percolating in Europe in various forms for centuries before that, and they had their roots in very much kind of daily life. So you take something like the notion of the social contract that you find with Hobbes and Rousseau and other Enlightenment thinkers, and Europe developed contract law early. And that's because they were and they also developed corporate law early. And that's because they had these voluntary associations, and they had to assign legal personalities to say this corporation can do stuff. Anybody can form a corporation. So they had laws for that. They had contract law where people can make bargains, and if we both agree to this, we'll do it. Strangers could do that. So these guys were already existed in a world with lots of contracts where corporations could just be formed and corporations could have identities. So the notion of the nation state as a corporate identity that could do stuff and act independently and required the consent of the governed, all of these ideas were already existed and were in practice, at least in lower forms. So things like representative government and democracy had been the way in which many European towns had been governing themselves for centuries. Now, not all, and there was plenty of monarchs and absolutism in different parts of Europe, but at the lowest level, at the town, the monastery, these organizations had voting, they had elections, they had all that kind of stuff. So it was just a matter of this all trickling up to the kind of elites and intellectuals who were on the scene when nation states started getting transformed by these ideas, which started at these much lower levels.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, because when we look back in history, we tend to have this sort of great man history, let's say, where we look into particular characters and their ideas and how their ideas influenced society. So, in general, do you think that ideas really influence society that much, or it is much more how certain particular behaviors and norms change society that then bring about those ideas?
Yeah, so I guess I'm interested in how we can illuminate that question more. I certainly think that the thing I'm emphasizing in the book is the kind of bottom up. The norms are already operative in the society, and the intellectuals are sort of assembling that into a case. Now, but I'm open to the idea that then, having built this nice edifice and put together these bits and pieces that are floating around in the flotsam and jetsam of culture at the lower levels, that then can have top-down effects. That seems totally plausible to me. In the book, I point out how, for various reasons related to luck and whatnot, some communities in Switzerland got democracy earlier. And then that means that they had a formal institution earlier, and that then affects their psychology later on. So if some of the kind of Enlightenment ideas that went on to influence large decision-making and the formation of institutions, those institutions can then have downstream effects. So we don't want to. So I'm not ready to say it's always bottom up. Sometimes it's also top down, but I just don't want people to forget about the bottom up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think that the bottom up prevails, because if it wasn't the case, if that wasn't the case, we wouldn't have to develop disciplines like sociology, anthropology, psychology to understand what are the forces, let's say, that operate in society, how people organize society, and things like that. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and related to what I just said, so you can have a heroic inventor who comes up with some great philosophy or some fun or some cool institution, but if it doesn't mesh with how people think or the psychology that's already and the social structure that's already in existence, the idea is not going to work. It's not going to go anywhere. Even if it's forcibly implemented, it's just going to create a big mess. So there has to be this fit between how people are thinking about the world, the mental models they're using, their emotions and preferences, the social organization. Do they have clans? Do they have age sets? Do they have singular monogamous nuclear families? And so that then has to fit together with higher level institutions or higher level policy decisions.
Mhm. So individuals created these sort of social organizations in cities, towns, etc., that were not kin-based. So now I'm going to quote you again. At a certain point you say, those dissatisfied with their current organization could move to another group or even start their own association. Successful associations were those that could attract and retain the highest quality and quantity of members. But doesn't this point at least to to the fact that certain people moved to these organizations because they had a particular set of personality traits, and then this could have a genetic basis to it?
Yeah, so let's see. So you mean so some kind of genetic selection? Yeah. So it's certainly the case that if there were, say, genetic variation in how much people trusted or how individualistic they were or something like that, then those folks would be most attracted to these towns, for example. But in the book, I make the case that because of something called the urban graveyard effect, that fact would actually result in selection against those traits, because such a high percentage of people who moved to the urban centers ended up dying of infectious disease, that you would have been much safer to stay in the hinterlands. So whatever traits attract you to towns was actually, those genes were under negative selection. So I think this is clearly a cultural evolutionary process because of the effect of the urban graveyard, which doesn't begin to abate until the 19th century. So in today's world, that's partially undone because cities are relatively healthy, pandemics aside, and although when people move to town, they tend to have fewer children. So there's still selection against that. It's just not the infectious disease side of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And where do work ethics come from, and how did it develop? Because you also refer to that in the book, and it has some important implications in terms of self-regulation, patience, and other aspects of psychology.
Yeah, well, so I think part of the evolution of individualism, and one of the ways that individuals want to set themselves apart is if you're moving to a new town and you're known to be someone who shows up punctually and someone who works really hard, then you can impress strangers. In a different world, people are, they have all these family ties. So, they would try to put pressure on you by telling your father that you keep showing up late, or your uncle or something like that, instead of just firing you. So there's more pressure on you to perform, to work hard. And you can see that appearing as early as the Cistercian order. So in the 11th century, the Cistercians they put a great deal of importance on the work ethic. And you can detect the effect in contemporary Europeans by looking at the density of Cistercian monasteries in different parts of Europe. And places that were denser with Cistercians have more of a work ethic today. Now you have to control for Catholicism versus Protestantism. This is mostly in Catholics, because later, as Weber argued long ago, Protestantism gets obsessed with the work ethic as well. And I think that's part of the story, is that the work ethic was actually important before Protestantism, wrapped in sacred cloth and made it something that God cares about. But that then just further accelerates it by doing that. So I think there's also evidence that Protestantism favors more of a work ethic.
Mm-hmm. And since this work ethic is so recent from an evolutionary perspective, do you think that could explain why there are so many people nowadays in industrialized societies that suffer psychologically from having to work in this sort of way?
Yeah, absolutely. It's also the reason why people don't like to work out at the gym, right? Because work is a pain, and it's more fun to lay on the couch. So yeah, but this, we can get a work ethic just because we're worried about things like guilt. We set personal standards for ourselves, and we try to live up to these personal standards, which could be, I want to get so much work done, or I shouldn't be goofing off, shouldn't be taking naps in the middle of the day. I guess it depends where you're from. Yeah, so all those things are just social values, but that then does create a conflict with the mammalians.
So you mentioned Protestantism and the effects that it had on society. Were or are Protestant societies more individualistic and even more weird than the societies that were under the influence of the Catholic Church, or not?
Yeah, so that's the case I make. So rather than starting with Protestantism, the book kind of, in the prelude, I reference Protestantism in terms of reading, but then the whole book goes by basically, and towards the end, I circle back to Protestantism because I think people were already becoming more individualistic, work was already an important value, and Protestantism just provides this religious overlay. It kind of wraps all those values and those features of psychology together, and then that then propels economic prosperity and other features, this emphasis on work. And I point to a few studies which seem to kind of really nail this down. So for a long time, this question about whether Weber was right or not has been difficult to answer because there's so many factors going on. So for one thing, there was a response. So there's a counter-reformation. So the Jesuits, for example, groups exposed to the Jesuits seemed to be pretty Protestant. The Jesuits adopted concern with education. Catholics started having more schools, and so they were competing with the Protestants on those grounds. I mentioned the Cistercians. When you analyze European data, you need to say, well, what's the presence of Cistercians, because that's going to make the Catholics look like more stronger workers. So you have all these interesting variables. But now there's a few natural experiments that economists have tapped into that do seem to suggest that Protestantism has an independent effect.
Mm-hmm. So we've already talked about how several different values that we tend to associate with the Enlightenment have a basis on these sociological changes that occurred that stemmed from the marriage and family program by the church. But let's talk now about science. What are the ingredients that we needed to have in how our societies are organized for science to develop?
Right. So there's a few different parts to this. One is the kind of sociological part. So one of the things that makes science so powerful is that it's a kind of voluntary association. In the sense that scientists, there might be many voluntary associations, but with some overarching framework, where we kind of keep an eye on each other. So peer review. When you write a paper, you send it to a journal who then has, other experts in the field look at it and they give you feedback. And it's only through that process of peer feedback that we decide to, there's no inherited roles for the most part that affect the field, so it's a voluntary association. And then at a psychological level, there's this sense that people want to do well. They want to kind of convince their friends that they have something important to contribute to the field. So that's this sense of individualism, setting yourself apart. And in terms of how science is actually done, you can see the analytic thinking coming through. So when scientists tackle problems, they reduce it. They break it down into its parts, and they often try to explain things by assigning properties to objects, which is one of the features of analytic thinking. So if you're thinking about particles, you might assign a charge or a spin to it if it's a quark. If it's a planet, you might assign a gravitational mass. If it's a person and you're a psychologist, you assign a personality. And if you're an economist, you assign a preference. So these are all kind of dispositional properties that we assign to individuals, and then we explain their behavior based on their personalities or their preferences, or the particle based on its charge or something like that. Whereas if you were more of a holistic thinker, you'd look at the relationships with people. Yes, if someone was behaving disrespectfully to another person, you wouldn't say, well, that person, this is a fundamental attribution error, is just a jerk. That's a dispositional. Instead, you would say, well, what's the relationship between those two? Maybe there's some problem between them, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So could we say that science is a cultural construct? If it had developed in different circumstances, could it be different than it is?
Yeah, I think so, and I think it's changing over time. So we can partially answer your question just by looking at what science was in 1500, what science was in 1800, and what science is in 2000. So it's definitely changed over time. The epistemology and the methods are always improving. They're always under question. Certainly a cultural institution. Now, does that mean we say it's the same as all other knowledge-generating institutions? Well, it has a good track record. So just because we say there are different institutions and there are sets of norms and they're evolved through cultural time doesn't mean that some can't be better at generating at least certain kinds of knowledge than other kinds of institutions. So that's my view on science.
Mm-hmm. So, and what about the Industrial Revolution? Why did it occur and why in England specifically?
So one of the big ideas that I develop in my previous book and this book is called the collective brain. And in the collective brain, the key to generating innovation, or what I call cumulative cultural adaptation, comes from the fact that different individuals are doing different things, they have different ideas, different experiences, they might even make different mistakes. And that by interacting, those ideas can combine to create new inventions. So in the book, I use a series of examples from the printing press to the steam engine to show how these things are recombinations of existing ideas. And one of the key things is where the individual who's actually credited as the inventor gets their ideas. They then bequeath this to someone else who adds different parts to it. So Bolton and Watt produced the famous steam engine, 1776, 1777, that then powers the Industrial Revolution. But Watt was actually working on the Newcomen steam engine, which is produced in 1712 by Newcomen, who got his idea about pressure cookers from the French Huguenot and ideas from different places, and he puts those together, passes them down to Watt. So then the key to explaining why a particular population becomes innovative is not so much about what's inside the heads of the individuals in the society, but it's about their social interconnections and about the ability of ideas to flow among diverse minds. And if you have something like a psychology of impersonal prosociality, then you're more willing to trust strangers, interact with them, share information. If you're literate, talked about how literacy comes from Protestantism, then you can read books, you can write books, you can pass information around through literacy. You can form these voluntary associations, and people can share information in those voluntary associations. So these are just some of the factors I talk about in the book that lead information to be flowing all throughout Europe and lead to an increasing amount of inventions coming out, beginning as early as 1500, but really accelerating in Britain around 1700, 750, something like that. And part of the things I point to in Britain are these scientific associations, which are proliferating all over Britain. And counties within Britain that get more of these scientific associations just produce more patents, for example. So you can look at the British patent data. Or you can look at award-winning inventions in the 1851 World's Fair. That can be traced back to these counties and then explained by these proliferating societies. Now, interestingly, there's certain brands of Protestantism which seem to favor the creation of these. So we might come full circle to the proliferation of different kinds of religions. Not all brands of Protestantism were favorable to these scientific societies, but some were, and those were popular in some counties in Britain.
Mm-hmm. And are there any changes that are occurring nowadays in Western society? I'm asking about Western society because that's what we are focusing on. Like at the level of institutions or technologies that would allow for us to make any predictions about how we could evolve psychologically in the future?
Well, I think that you can see the continuing trend of individualism in the declining importance of families. So, for a long time, the monogamous nuclear family was the benchmark. But now there's lots more individuals who are not getting married or getting married later, having few kids. Women don't need husbands now, so they can just have kids without getting a husband. So you're getting, and there's potentially lots of childcare, depends which country you're in and the quality of the childcare. But that trend is leading more and more to greater individualism. And families may even, it's possible to go below the nuclear monogamous family because you can just have individuals who have children. At least women can do that. Men can adopt, I guess. So that's one trend, greater individualism. And of course, the internet holds the potential to further weave together the collective brain. So we can swap ideas now much more rapidly over the internet. The internet has the same problem that communication has always had, which is that there can be a lot of false and misleading or other kinds of information. So the internet allows that to fly even faster. So it's still going to be about cooperation and informational sorting. It's still going to be a crucial thing.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that anywhere in the future we could amass enough knowledge for us to be able to consciously and purposefully engineers society, or do you think that it is better to leave it just to cultural evolution and to group selection at the cultural level and things like that?
Yeah, so I actually spend more time on this question in The Secret of Our Success at the end. And the case I make there is what I think I take from having studied all this stuff is that we can take advantage of selection and variation systems by doing experiments, essentially. So, you're not sure what's the best organization for your company, so you can set up a bunch of different similar departments using different organizational strategies, and then let them compete and see which one wins. It's in some sense the systems where firms compete is creating that kind of dynamic. But we could build that more consciously into the system. More experimentation where you try the same thing two different ways, and so you kind of test your thing as you go along. So actively building in a cultural group selection system.
Mm-hmm. And with all of these that we've been talking about in this conversation, what are the main reasons, or what would you say are the main reasons why we had recently a crisis in social psychology, a replication crisis? I mean, we talked about, for example, cognitive dissonance and the fundamental attribution error that seem to operate mainly in weird minds and not exactly the same in non-weird minds. So what are, in your mind, some of the reasons for this to have occurred?
Yeah, the main one that I've been emphasizing, I think, is the lack of a coherent cumulative theory in at least parts of psychology. My friends in cognitive science or cognitive psychology would disagree with or caution me about generalizing too broadly, but certainly in mainstream social psychology and certainly good swaths of developmental psychology, there's nothing that looks to me like a cumulative theory that gives you predictions ahead of time, where the predictions are derived. There's no tradition of formal modeling. So I think, and those things, because the theory will tell you if a result is surprising, like should we be shocked and immediately replicate this, or is this kind of what we'd expect, and it's consistent with 5 other findings that kind of form mutually reinforcing network of results that tell the same story from a theoretical point of view. So I think that's the big problem. And I have a paper with Michael Muthu Krishna where we kind of lay out some of these ideas. Mm-hmm. Now, I think when you do that right, then you think about things like, well, can I generalize from these undergraduates? Because you have a theory that says either I should be able to say it's a dominance display or a pride display. I ought to be able to go to New Guinea and see this display. And if I don't, then the theory is wrong. Rather than, something like a typical priming experiment, if you don't get it, the conditions were just slightly off and you don't really worry about it. You just move on and try to reprime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now I have here a set of questions coming from a follower, Rob Sika, a follower of the show. So the first one is, why do you think genes contribute little to contemporary psychological variation? And if they do, why they may be pushing in the opposite direction to that assumed?
Yeah, so, there's 2 different questions buried in there. It could be that genes play a role in psychological variation within groups. So you got to distinguish within groups, between groups. The general reason why to be suspect of any genetic variation between groups is because humans are so well mixed. And, to the best of our knowledge, the continental genetic variation that we observe is just due to the early migrations of human populations. Nobody's been able to identify a continental level selection pressure. So there's no reason to suspect there to be genes that have been under selection at like sort of large global continental levels. Now, that doesn't mean that if we take individuals within a population, we wouldn't expect there to be some genetic variation. So things like population genetics not population genetics, behavioral genetics suggest that can play an important role. Having said that, there's an important caveat in the cultural evolutionary world on that. Are certain kinds of traits, cultural evolution will actually push to maximize the genetic variation. Because if it likes a certain phenotype, like high IQ, then it will squeeze out all the non-genetic variation. And that'll give you a high heritability. So cultural is actually creating a high heritability, where if you did it in a different population where those skills weren't locally valued, then you would see a much lower heritability. So I think sometimes that's just a cautionary note on thinking about heritability. In the case of the material I laid out today, I kind of already suggested the answer to the question, which is that because people were moving into these urban centers and those urban centers were death traps, then that's going to create selection against any genes for things like individualism or trust. So if anything, the selection would be pushing in the opposite direction.
Yeah. So
and
the
we know, like the example I use in the book, that we know that culture can fight its way against a weaker genetic opponent is in the case of schooling. So there's these genes showing what leads to high educational attainment. And those have been under negative selection in the 20th century for the simple reason that women especially, but also men, when they go to college, higher education, they have fewer babies because their reproductive period gets shorter. It's not complicated math. But at the same time, the number of years of education has gone up massively in the 20th century. So cultural evolution drove it up, and genetic evolution drove it down a tiny bit. So culture is winning in that case.
Yeah. So the next question is, how do you think your view about the plasticity of cultural psychology differs from evolutionary psychologists' ideas about variations evoked culture produces stemming from a universal mental architecture?
So in the book, I try to be relatively open to all different sources of psychological variation. So there are ways in which cultural evolution can build new kinds of psychology, like we talked about with reading. There are ways that cultural evolution can manipulate, evoke psychology. So this is an idea that I associate with Cosmede and Tooby, in which they call it the jukebox metaphor. So there could be psychology that's tuned to certain environments. So you have a lot of pathogens in your environment, and you might start avoiding people or something like that. And the idea would be you can somehow sense that this is a disease-prone environment, and so you start avoiding other people. I'm open to that, and the thing you have to appreciate, though, is that culture can manipulate the input conditions. So, for example, there's a lot of work in the field of life history suggesting that shocks of calories during early life, the first 5 years, might cause a whole series of psychological changes related to patience and other kinds of cognitive effects. But we can have things like social safety nets, where we prevent the entire population or most of the population from experiencing a famine because of some kind of cultural institution. So that actually manipulates that piece of evoked culture. So that's one way that cultural evolution can alter our psychology, by manipulating our evoked culture. And I think that's probably the case for some things. And there's also the facultative effects. So there's certain cues in the world make us behave better. The one I use in the book is if you prime people with God, believers, they behave as if they're being watched, right? Because they believe there's a God who cares about their moral behavior. So reminding them of that God causes them to comply with that God's wishes more. That's an evoked effect, and it's playing on some kind of reputational concern, normative psychology. So it's a facultative psychological effect, but it's manipulated like crazy by religion. So I use all of those different ways of affecting psychological variation.
Mm-hmm. What do you think are the prospects of regions with intensive kin-based regions, such as Middle East to liberal? What do you think are the prospects of regions with intensive kin-based institutions, such as the Middle East, to liberalize?
Gosh, I don't think I have a strong view on any of that. I mean, I do think you can. It is interesting the way religion has shaped social structure historically in the Middle East. So I mentioned earlier that the Quran has this idea that daughters have to inherit half of what sons inherit. And as Islam spread, that became the policy in lots of places, a religious norm that people had to comply with. And that then caused a phenomenon that's otherwise unheard of in the anthropological record, called parallel cousin marriage, which is where you marry your father. It's actually patrolateral parallel cousin marriage. So if you're a woman, you marry your father's brother's son. And that causes the clan to nest internally rather than building relationships with other clans. And this might lead to a psychology that sort of is stronger on in-group solidarity, which is great for in-group solidarity, but it can also create conflicts amongst other clans because you don't have any of these bridging ties. I mean, in the modern world, if with the right government policies and urbanization, opportunities to meet strangers, relaxations of norms about who you can marry, the social structure will just rewire itself and people's psychology can adapt.
Okay. So the next question is if you think that polygamy should be permitted in liberal democracies. We've already talked about the effects of monogamous marriage, so do you think that we could allow for polygamy in Western industrialized societies?
Yeah, so I've been an expert witness on this, and what I told the judge is that the important thing is to recognize that there are trade-offs. So the factors that we talked about create a public bad. So you have this large pool of unmarried men who are going to have to be, either you're going to need a lot of police or they have to be dealt with in some way because they're going to be inclined to commit crimes, and you need some, I mean, you can imagine a whole bunch of institutions to handle that. And then the question is how you trade off dealing with that public bad against the value of liberty, freedom, freedom of association, so great Western values. And I mean, I guess I'm back to the idea we talked about and how we do policy. I'm happy to see Let 1,000 Flowers Bloom, because maybe there are creative ways to have the freedom, which would be polygyny, without creating all the downside effects. The monogamy solution is one solution. And I don't know, we haven't seen historically another way to deal with that problem that seems good. There are ways to deal with that problem in smaller scale societies, or if you have high levels of warfare, things like that. But those don't seem like ones we want to implement. But cultural evolution is more creative than we are. So there could be something I haven't thought of.
By the way, what are some of those solutions that more traditional societies have for that problem?
Well, one is the age set system. So in an age set system, the young men are kind of under the command of the elders. The elders are polygynous. They take multiple wives. The young men can't marry. They often can't even have sex, especially not with anyone's wives. And the way they can get wives is by raiding other groups. And so this gives kind of a motivation and solidarity to groups to go out and conquer other groups and steal women. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That doesn't seem like a real solution.
Yeah. Okay, so the last question is, what are your views about personality? Because in the book you talk about the weird five, right? Instead of the big five, the weird five. So what are your views about that?
Well, so within the psychology literature, there is something called the Big Five, which is the Big Five set of personality traits, and it's been replicated amongst urbanized industrial students in lots of places. And I make the case in the book that this configuration of personality is probably the result of occupational environments where there's lots of social niches, lots of different occupations, and people can fit themselves to different occupational niches. This argument is made by a number of other folks, Paul Smaldino, Mike Girvin, and others. And we see that, and you also have to be mobile, so you have to be able to pick your occupation. So lots of societies over human history have had lots of occupations, but you were very likely to go into one occupation depending on your caste or your class or your clan. All these things would guide you into it. But in a world where you have a wide choice of possible occupations, you can fit it. So if you're more of an introvert, you might become an economist or a computer programmer. If you like to talk, maybe you become a used car salesman. If you like quiet rooms, maybe you become a librarian. So in the sense that you can kind of find the occupation that fits some of your genetic predispositions, and that then exaggerates things and creates this complex thing. When Mike Girvin and colleagues do the same Big Five amongst the Chamane, a group of forager horticulturalists in the Bolivian Amazon, they find just two personality dimensions, kind of an industrious dimension and a prosociality dimension. And that's because everybody has to do everything. You're either a man or a woman. And if you're a man, you're a farmer, a fisher, a hunter. And if you're a woman, you have a bunch of farming tasks, and you also have household, childcare, things like that. So there's no niche diversity.
Mhm. Okay, so Dr. Henrich, let's end the interview here. Before we go, like last time, would you like to mention some of the best places on the internet for people to get access to your work?
Pretty much everything is on my Harvard website. So if you Google me, I'm first up.
Okay, great. So, guys, again, the book is The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. And since you guys in the US are still going through the coronavirus in a complicated way, I mean, it's every day it's like 50,000 new cases or something. You're mostly at home, so please go to the Amazon link I will leave down below and order the book because it's really, really interesting and I mean, one of my favorite books that I read this year. So thank you a lot, Dr. Henrich, for writing it and for being on the show again.
Great. Good to be with you, Ricardo. Thanks.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And I also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karin Litske and Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klimpy, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Belby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Leibrant, Oslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, and Yacila Deza Araújo. My producers is our Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Gidi, and my executive producers, Michel Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.